All right, we're going to try and roll along now because we have two panel sessions set up for this afternoon. So while that first panel is actually loading on deck here, that would be great. I'd like to introduce Claudio Andrita. So Claudio is the Director of P3 Business Development with Johnson Controls, and Johnson Controls is sponsoring this session. There you are, Claudio. Well, there you are, Claudio. How many Claudios are there in the room? Only one that counts, exactly. Off you go. Thank you.
Hello, so I'm Claudio Andretta, thanks Mark, with Johnson Controls. Johnson Controls is pleased to sponsor today's panel entitled Curves Ahead, Rethinking Transportation in the Age of Driverless Vehicles. So Johnson Controls is, in the P3 world, we act as the operator on these design, build, finance, maintain projects. We're actually the largest service company provider on P3s in Canada. We've won over 35 projects. And so, some of the projects that we've been involved with include the award-winning Milton Hospital that was awarded yesterday, and then the recently awarded Abbotsford Law Courts project. Our role is to make buildings safe and comfortable and very productive in a P3 environment. So I'm kind of curious in the world of autonomous vehicles, how they think about the interior, and we'll hear a bit about that. So on behalf of Johnson Controls, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the session, Sarah Houde, Executive Director of Propulsion Quebec. Last year, she was named Executive Director of Quebec's new industrial cluster for electric and smart vehicles, and was tasked with positioning the province as one of the sector's global leaders. Previously, she worked in communications in the private and nonprofit sectors, including the private equity firm XPND Capital, where she helped steer a number of transport electrification projects. Please join me in welcoming Sarah and the rest of the panel.
Thank you. We have Adam. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to Andreas from Keolis, who I think provided us with a very interesting presentation, and we'll try to tap in the presentation and expand some ideas. So we have with us Sharad Agarwal, Senior Vice President, North America at EasyMile. Manufacturer, and you'll present yourself, manufacturer of an AV vehicle. Marko Kroenke.
Yep, pretty good.
That was fine. Head of Technology, Global Product Management at Bombardier Transportation, and Adam Blinick, Director of Public Policies and Communications at Uber Canada. So maybe we'll start by you presenting a little bit yourself, your experience, and the latest project that you've been working on related to AV. Please.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Sharad Agarwal. I'm the Senior Vice President of EasyMile. EasyMile is an autonomous vehicle technology company focusing on low-speed technology for commercial vehicles. And there's a difference when it comes to low-speed technology and versus kind of what you see a lot in the news, is that we go on a very predefined route. Our roads, we map out everywhere where we're going to go ahead of time. We check out risk assessment. We determine what mitigations we need to really make sure that the project goes on very successfully. And we've operated over 250,000 kilometers without an accident, transporting 320,000 people by taking that approach. Right now, our technology is on two different products. One is on a passenger vehicle called the Easy-10, which transports 12 to 15 people, depending on which country you're in. It's all electric. The second product that our technology is available is called the Track Easy. It's a baggage carrier. That project is a combination of our technology and TLD-16, which is those little two-man tugs that you see at the airport. That's what we've done for an automation on that side. We're also working with a number of major OEMs in Europe. One is Alstom, another one is Iveco, looking at automating trams, 12-meter vehicles. We're also looking now into agriculture and road construction, really anything that has a really predefined domain. And that's really where we're focusing on right now. And I think the main reason that we're doing that is because right now you need to be able to balance the technology, the cost of technology versus commercial application. We'd love to be able to put on a number of cameras, LiDARs, radars, X-ray vision, whatever, on the car or on the vehicle, but it's just not cost effective to make a real ROI for the end user. So we're really a low-speed technology towards commercial vehicles. Oh, and sorry, well, in Canada, we actually have two projects, one in Montreal and another one in Edmonton right now.
Thanks a lot, Marko Kroenke. Sorry for my German name and difficult one, but I can promise you that my kids will speak Canadian dialect now after having the 7th year winterized in Canada. Bombardier Transportation is a train manufacturer, you all know, so what the heck are we dealing with AVs? But you know that we have automatic systems since almost 50 years. So the first APM, automated people mover, was for Tampa Airport in 1971. So a fully driverless automated system transporting people. And we moved along this chain pretty much with enhanced system. There was not a single accident in automated operation since this time. There had been accident, but only when there was like manual interfaces up there. So I guess what I want to say is, I think from the railway industry, in terms of safety functional aspects, we can bring a lot into the autonomous world there. For me, it's a complementary technology in terms of mobility solution.
Adam?
Thank you. Adam Blinick, Director of Public Policy and Communications for Uber Canada. I'll be a little selfish here. I don't spend all that much time in the self-driving space, even though Toronto is the location of Uber's only international self-driving lab, led by Raquel Urtasun. But I think a key thing to have as part of a discussion like this, and what I often find is helpful, is to kind of take the gaze from the future. I think sometimes when we talk about self-driving, we immediately go into this state where we're talking about technologies that are not yet ready and postulating on what infrastructure should look like. And we lose sort of sight of what's in front of us, what the present looks like. And one thing I want to underscore and use my time here, because it is where I spend a lot of my time when it comes to self-driving, is trying to articulate that there's so much that we can be doing today to put forward a vision of what we want our cities to look like, and that there are so many steps that we can actually take with existing technology and existing infrastructure to actually put us down a particular path that will make for better cities. I think so often with self-driving, we find ourselves in a situation where we almost frame it as a technology that's happening to us, and so then it's a question of how do we accommodate it. Mm-hmm. And I'd argue that we live in cities today that are actually somewhat structured based on a similar approach to the automobile, where we didn't actually take a proactive view of what we wanted our cities to look like, and so as a result, we live in cities where we have lots of roads, lots of urban sprawl, lots of congestion, lots of parking. And what I'd actually encourage us to do, kind of picking up on lots of themes that Andreas raised, there's a lot there that I would agree with, some stuff that obviously I wouldn't, but I think there's so much we can do today to pave the road to actually an efficient use of autonomous that's based on shared mobility. That is definitely transit being a huge part of it, car share, ride share, as well as active modes. We can get more into this as well, but there's just so much that we can do today that would set us up for success so that when this technology is ready, it enters into the mix and that we don't give up, we don't increase congestion, we don't make our cities less livable, but we actually are adopting the technology in a way that fits with our vision for what we want our cities to look like.
So I'll start by you for our first question, because please explain a little bit more in details what you see as being short, medium, and long-term vision of AV and how it will integrate in the future of mobility. We have 10 minutes. We have 4 questions, 10 minutes per question. So we'll have to show solidarity between the 3 of you so that we all can have 2-3 minutes per person.
Sure. So if you just look at the city mix today, or how our cities are structured today. In the U.S. right now, ride sharing makes up to 1 to 2% of kilometers driven in the U.S. Transit makes up another 3%. So 90% of the kilometers driven or more is actually being taken up by people driving their own cars. And so like the one thing we can be doing over time is actually incentivizing people by providing them with actually alternatives to car ownership to transition to a life where they're adopting other shared modes and active modes of transportation. As part of that, I think there's a lot of conversation we can have around infrastructure today, making the roads safer in terms of more dedicated bike lanes, a more progressive approach to parking, infrastructure. And with that, we think that the initial wave of AVs, the artificial intelligence or the self-driving technology we're developing will actually work very well with today's roads. So it's actually, I think, setting up today's roads more for success for self-driving. The transition will take time. I think we should be expecting that there will be a number of years where there'll be both human and autonomous cars on the road. And so I think before we kind of walk in this issue, we do need to crawl a bit. And I think it's taking those steps of trying to set up our infrastructure in a way that encourages, inspires people to leave their car at home, assume other modes of transportation, and then once you've done that, I think it's just almost like an incremental step to make sure that, you know, the roads are paved well enough, the lines are clear enough, the dedicated bike lanes are there, to make sure that the self-driving component of it fits really well in with your overall safety mix for cities.
And Sharad, maybe you can also give us your vision on short, medium, and long term, but also explain a little bit how your type of vehicle that's pre-programmed will be integrated into future mobility compared to self-driving vehicles that will be operating in whatever types of settings.
I always kind of look at autonomous vehicle as similar to riding a bike. And there's different evolutions to when you're where it is. So the first step in mobility is you're a baby and you have the car your mom pushes around. You know, that's like a guided, you have a fixed guideway, kind of this first level of where autonomy is. It's like you're controlled, supervised, and it's comfortable. The second generation is really the trike, which is where we think we are at this point, whereas you have a limited range, lower speed, but it is a capable means of transportation, which is kind of the area that we're in. The next level is a bike with training wheels. So a lot of the self-driving cars, the Ubers, the Waymos, they're really in that space where they're really out there, but they still have a safety driver, and they're just kind of on that cusp of being able to ready to go and ride their own bike. And so I think that they're in the evolution of where we're at from the short and medium terms. I think we're right in that kind of trike and training wheel side, but we're not quite ready to get into the single bikes, kind of free flowing anywhere that you want to go. With our vehicle, I mean, we're really focused right now on the short range transportation. So things like airports and hospitals where you have a lot of density and you have a short distance to travel, where if you're traveling under 20 kilometers an hour, it's an acceptable form because you're not going to walk because of the heat or the weather or you're carrying luggage. So in the interim is like, we're really focused on the short-term high-density areas, and that'll expand into then connecting into transit systems, being able to go through neighborhoods quickly and be able to efficiently move people from home to major transit hubs in that area.
So how do you think that the more high frequency, high density, higher volume types of vehicles, like the one that you're doing at Bombardier, will integrate in that short, mid-term?
I fully agree that we always talk about mobility solution and the need of people, the need of a city to have a certain capacity, and different modes have their advantages in specific areas here. Whereas I do see the complementary of trains, trams, systems, which can be way higher automatized, having as well more digitalized elements, whether it's applications these days. And the AV systems currently start more on the last mile application. So they fit quite well together, I believe.
Okay, so from your perspective, you've been working at the international level with different types of partner. How is Canada doing on the AV front? Are we ahead? Are we behind from your point of view? Maybe Sharad.
Sure. We've had some very good interactions with Transport for Canada and really in how entering into the market looks like. One thing that I've been really impressed with is that the team there is very educated. They spent a lot of time understanding the difference between what we do, which is shared autonomy, versus compliant vehicles, CMVSS compliant vehicles. So they definitely understood the differences from the space. They created safety assessments. They're encouraging a lot more research. They're putting investment into research. And so I think that what we've seen so far, Transport for Canada is making some really good some really good strides in becoming to make it a very hospitable environment for AV. We even had they asked some direct questions to us, including, where have you seen successes in other countries? So it seems that the Canada is very open for AV technology and advancing it, and so we've been very pleased so far.
Yeah, it's both. It's from the past as well for automated trains. As you may know, the first fully driverless trains have been developed in Kingston. One is delivered to Scarborough, even there's a driver, but just, reading his book. The Vancouver one in 1986 delivered there is the first fully driverless system there. And what we see now is as well, where we move along with the Kutrick organization and a lot of other institutes around Canada with governmental support, pushing really the AV technology to bring to a common standard, to have the interoperability of systems, to have common requirements in order not to, divide the system in squadred systems. And I think I've seen Josipa here as well. I guess she will explain a little bit of the program then later.
Yeah, the second panel, so please stay for that second panel. Adam, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'll probably address a different issue where I think the government's also really succeeding. They've really created an environment with Canada's diversity and smart investments in standing up institutes like the Vector Institute to really create an ecosystem where machine learning AI talent wants to come to Canada, wants to stay in Canada, retain their talent here. We're an example of that. Raquel Erdeson is a professor at U of T. She's the one who's running our self-driving lab. And it was paramount importance for her to stay in Toronto as she was considering exploring options in the private sector. And the work that the government has done to make cities like Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton attractive places for talent, I think creates this flywheel effect where, the more talent that's here helping develop actually the technology, the more investments that we'll see and the more kind of connectivity we can have with government in terms of having conversations about what future infrastructure, what future regulations should look in this space. So I think there's just been a lot of really great work done to ensure that we're building the right ecosystem. So we're also developing the technology here to not just deploying it.
And in terms of regulations and public policies, how is it to work with Canadian governments, so federal, provincial, and municipal, in terms of R&D projects, but also on related to putting new types of vehicles on the road, either on the roads or on the rails? How is it to work? Do you have an ideal example or experience that you had with another country or with another subregion, for example, to give us? Maybe Marko, you can start.
Yeah, there's huge programs ongoing, both with Transport Canada and many multiple organizations, which give both direct funding on progress, but as well creating industry partnerships, which are then funded or going via universities, funding these ones, which helps us then in order to just leverage on R&D projects. That's it. Canada, I really can compare these ones to European countries, are a great country for this.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that. I'd say that, specifically in the province of Ontario, when it comes to self-driving testing, I think the government has put together a really good pilot project framework in which to operate within that puts safety first and does allow for testing. And so I just think that, there's probably various levels of government actually taking on the role of helping invite players to come into the space and work responsibly to help advance this in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar. And just looking around the world, in the European markets are probably a little bit more mature than North America when it comes to AV. There's a lot of investment. Even in Germany, there's some standards now where they're developing real almost like testing and licensing towards that. Australia is opening up. And it's just a combination of regulation and funding. Really the next couple of years on our space is going to needs a lot of public funding to really get the demonstrations out. There's not a lot of companies out there that can just kind of really do it on their own in real demonstrations. So I think that Canada is definitely catching up to what the Europeans are, and I think it's probably more similar to a lot of countries in the world.
And compared to the US?
The U.S. is a bit different in the sense that the regulation is actually somewhat favorable, but we don't have there's not a lot of direct funding. States have different air quality grants and different things, but there's really not innovation funds, or it's not as centralized as it is in other countries where the funding is that available. It's really looking at a lot of local transit systems, local cities, and they're looking at very different pockets, and they're a lot smaller buckets of money. In reality, we haven't seen anywhere near the investment that we're seeing in Europe or even Australia, now Canada.
Okay, so you three are three very different companies, different sizes, different products. So, and you mentioned it a little bit in your introduction. How do you see yourself as being complementary in the future of mobility? Marko, maybe you can start, like, and how can you, or will you be complementary in scaling up to the next level, just after we do all the demos and we are done with pilot projects and we really want to scale it up? How do you see yourself as being complementary?
Yeah, I believe we have to consider the infrastructure, where our vehicles are running, where they are operated, and typically the infrastructure are like 80% of the total costs of a system. So if you think about, increasing efficiency, leverage more out of the existing, we have to optimize the total systems. And this is where automatization takes place with, lowering the headways, meaning, higher frequency of systems. They are just increasing the capacity of the system. Connecting the system, what you just mentioned, so this is crucial for overall mobility increase of these ones. And this is where I see the complementary factor by how do we optimize the entire system by leverage on the highest cost, which is typically the infrastructure cost, and not on the vehicle. We look at the vehicle prices. I guess we more live in a world where we look for high safety. From railway perspective, we don't accept fatalities in our design process. So it's way, way higher than the automotive industry. We have so-called must-ride systems on airports. So a stop of the system is a no-go because no planes can leave or arrive anymore. So the availability of the system and the expectation to transit systems is extremely high. This is where I see we can bring a lot from the railway industry into the autonomous world when we talk about transit systems and you provide shuttle systems. So not so much the individual traffic up there. So this is where I see we come much closer together in the future.
I think, I think that there's a lot of complementary pieces to this. And with the trains, you have really the trunks, the high density, the kind of single distances, and we're evolving into 12 and 24 and 30 passenger buses. And Andreas showed earlier some of the inefficiencies and the subsidies that's required for public transit. So I think what we'll end up seeing is that the core heavy populated routes, every city has routes that probably do break even or even able to create some income off of the fares. And those are where our technology will be focused on is those core trunk, high volume, high density areas. And then it's a perfect complement to Uber and their technology to bring the people to those trunks. So, the train will be the core long distance, the buses will be kind of the trunks in the middle, and then with Uber being able to feed those trunks, it's a really complementary, all the three different technologies.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I think today when people think of Uber, they do think of ride sharing, but I wouldn't be surprised within 6 months or a year when we say the word Uber, we actually think of a platform. And April this past year, our CEO made a number of announcements that were really quite exciting. One was the acquisition of Jump Bikes. It's an e-bike and scooter company. Mm-hmm. The average distance that a rider takes in one of those is around 5 kilometers. So that's actually a pretty good distance. It takes away a lot of your kind of typical shorter trips. And what we've seen in San Francisco with Jump Bikes is that overall usage of the Uber app has gone up by about 15%, but car trips have gone down, and the delta is actually bikes, particularly during rush hour. So people are kind of voting with their feet or with their legs when it comes to active modes of transportation, that those shorter trips are actually better suited for bikes than they are for cars. And so that's one way that we actually are already starting to see us move into a broader space with other modes of transportation. That same day, we announced a partnership with Misabi, which some in the room might know, but that's a payments company used by many different transit agencies, with the goal of actually being able to partner with them, with the transit agencies, so you could actually purchase a transit token through the Uber app. That obviously is not the end game. I think what we're looking for is more of a seamless experience that people can actually take a bike to a pool trip to a transit line. But we view this as totally complementary. We're not going to substitute for mass transit. Mass transit makes a ton of sense in our urban areas. They'll do things better than we will ever do. But as I mentioned off the bat, in most of our cities, the vast majority of kilometers driven are being done by people driving alone. And if we can actually go after those people collectively and offer them a suite of options that are super simple to access in a reliable and an affordable manner, we will do more to reduce congestion today and pave the way for self-driving cars in the future. And one point I always like to do to drive home this point, I typically say I now have an 18-month-old at home. And if you look, fast forward into the future, 15 years, what are the chances that boy runs out and gets his license as soon as he's eligible? And I often say this in a room like this, and then someone puts up their hand and says, my daughter is 21 and at university, and she won't get a license. And so I think that the world is changing. Millennials' attitudes toward car ownership is not the same as even people my age. And that future generations will even have less of a connection to the idea of owning a car that typically sits around idle for 95% of the time, costing a lot of money. And so, once again, I always kind of just try and overstress this, but there's so much that can be done today with existing infrastructure and existing technology to build that network to complement other modes of transit other than personal vehicles in a way that I think would, put us on a better path for when self-driving technology is more ready for the road and for adoption.
Actually, in Montreal, they did a study at the Commerce University School of Commerce, and 33% of the students have no intention of ever taking their license. So that's students that are 20, 21. So.
Yeah, and just think about from that perspective, future condo builds, how much cheaper they'll be to do if you don't have to break bedrock. I mean, I think in Toronto it's something like, you might quote me on this, but you shouldn't because I'm not an expert, but like $60,000 to $80,000 for a parking space downtown, right?
It's 50 in Montreal.
Okay.
I just met with a promoter last week,
Yeah,
and
so
it's 48 to 60.
And think about how much capacity you can build on existing roads today if you were actually able to take away parking or reduce the need of parking and have smart pickup drop-off locations. So some of this is still future, like we're not all the way there yet, but that's the kind of potential we're talking about when you start talking about 33% of people moving away from car ownership.
Mm-hmm. And then the investment in infrastructure will not be that much into roads because we will maybe double the capacity of actual roads, but in other smart infrastructures, which will really come to as a complement to what's already there.
Right.
And in Montreal also, it made me think, when we have a bike sharing, we had that for many years now. When it happened in Montreal, the Metropolitan, the Public Transit Authority saw that as a competitor, and they were really seeing it as and then they realized that after 1 or 2 years that it helped to increase their own traffic. Because really they were taking clients from solo driving, away from solo driving, because they were offering a solution for people taking public transit but not getting to the final destination. So then we have a partnership between the bike sharing and the Public Transit Authority.
So just to give you a little bit of a local flavor for this as well, most people might have heard of our partnership with Innisfil, where the town of Innisfil, just a little bit north of here, was looking for a public transit option, and it just didn't make sense for a town their size in that footprint. So we've been working with them in a way that has some system that's kind of, that replicates a bit of public transit, but that makes sense for that city. But what's interesting is the #1 destination for our service there is the South Barrie GO station. And another top 5 location are the GO stations along Yonge Street in Innisfil. So people are using our service there to connect to mass transit and then get into Toronto or get into Newmarket or wherever they're going. And so it's already happening. People are organically adopting the technology in a way that they're matching up these different modes of transportation and not taking their own car.
Okay, well, before we go to questions, maybe you want to take 2 minutes for closing remarks, and then we will get to questions. You have the instructions there if you want to ask questions to our panelists. Sharad.
I just wanted to thank the opportunity to be here. It's great, a very good panel to be on. Like I said, it's very much complementary. There's a lot of different things happening in AV, not only in passenger transportation, but in cargo and in shipping, agricultural, and I think it's just a really exciting time to be in transportation. I think it's the first time in my 15-year career that people actually want to listen to about transportation, so I think it's a really exciting time, and we do expect it to be exponential. I think the next 2 to 3 years, while the regulations and the cost of the technology goes down, the regulations kind of catch up and the technology costs go down, it's just going to be a steady growth, and it's just going to skyrocket in the next 2 to 5 years somewhere.
Yeah, I'm engineer and I'm by heart like a train person, but I can't and I don't want to ignore the AV technology, and I see the high degree of flexibility it gives and really the advantage of complementary of the systems of mobility solution is key for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll just, first off, also thank you for having me. This has been a really fun conversation and a great conference. I'd also just pick up on a point that Andreas made during his keynote. I really do think that this is an exciting time. I think there's more dynamic in the space than, I don't know, probably in the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important moment for us to seize, and part of that is actually breaking down the silos, and that's within government, but that's also between private sector and government to take a more holistic look about what our transit system or our cities look like, and what do our residents expect, and what does the future of cities look like, how can we make them better, and then move with that vision forward, adopting policies that actually make our streets safer, less congested, less polluted, and free up space for other things like parks and schools and more affordable housing.
Okay, so let's go to questions. We have 2 here. So the first one is, how does the electric supply of AV impact global warming? You want to go ahead? I would say first, it depends where you take your electricity from.
Yeah,
you produce your electricity.
I think it's something like 22% or around there of all global emissions are from transportation.
Yeah.
And so obviously, if you can have a clean source for the electric grid, AVs can actually greatly reduce our consumption. But I would also say, once again, talking about incrementality, things like ride sharing, car sharing, as I said, the average personal vehicle is being used 5% of the time. Once you up that percentage to a significant amount, I think EVs will become more attractive, because the more kilometers you get out of them, the more the efficiency from not being fuel dependent makes sense from an economic standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so once again, I think there's probably steps along the way where you're not just waiting for the electrification of AVs to be your solution here. You can actually try and take policies that will increase green vehicles on the grid today.
Mm-hmm. And that's really assuming that all AVs, all autonomous vehicles are 100% electric, but this is really what we see right now on the market.
Yeah, I think that's a good expectation, actually, because just from an autonomous perspective, technology perspective, electric vehicles are simpler to autonomize versus using a traditional CVE or combustion engine. So I think that's a pretty likelihood that AVs will always be electric.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's coming, but the other aspect is really the capacity. How much can you fill your vehicle all over the time? Because this is then the impact on the environment. And I think, systems getting smarter and smarter, where people are moving, where people are going, in order to decrease the empty load of vehicles. We already did some studies about the high degree of flexibility of autonomous system, just can decrease a fleet by up to 20% versus fixed routing systems. So you don't change anything, it's just your matter of operation. has a positive impact on just, moving of vehicle, which has impact on environment then, right?
And that also assumes that EVs and AVs will really take their place into a fleet management, which we didn't really discuss, but also really makes the difference, because operating costs for electric vehicles is really going down when you're operating fleet, not only parking at 90% of the time, 95% of the time, because you're operating it on a single basis. And same thing for autonomous vehicle, because autonomous vehicle, the first one will really be operated within a fleet, because you need to tune it, you need to calibrate it every day, you need to make sure it's clean, that the cameras, the lidars can really see, so you really need to curate it. So yeah, that also takes that into consideration. So we've lost one question. We had two. Now we have two new questions, but we'll go with these ones.
Liability.
It became the first one now. Okay. So what is the solution to liability exposure with AVs? Is this issue holding back adoption?
I can take that one.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So first of all, it's not holding back adoption at all. We've had a number of conversations. Our company is insured by some of some very well-known global carriers. I think the next couple of years, there's a very low risk in AV, because you're a safety driver. So you have almost two layers of safety. You have the technology that's providing the first layer, and you have a backup driver to hold that on. So there's definitely not any slowdown due to liability. There's going to be a lot of question marks once the fully autonomous, and you have a number of cars on the road, and who's at fault? Is it the owner, the operator, the technology company, product liability? There will be quite a bit of discussion on who's going to be there, but I think the government will probably play a role in kind of determining where liability is going to stand, and I think that'll essentially evolve into unfortunately, two or three accidents, and it'll get figured out. But right now, yeah, definitely not hold back for the technology growing.
Yeah, until we still have like students or attendant on board, it's pretty clear that there's a human safety factor directly involved in the vehicle. But when we go to the next level of fully driverless system, I personally believe that we will have a central control system, or more like a system that's a supervisory system, where we will have as well monitoring of people of the entire fleet, not only fleet management, but as well as supervisory system, where it's clear defined where the liability is then within the operator then.
I think we should move on to the next question. I don't really have much to add.
Okay. So does rail or using existing dedicated rights of way have a role in AV? Maybe Adam, you can go, or well, any one of you have a different
I don't know
point
if
of view.
you might have more particular perspective on this one.
It's much easier to start with dedicated right of way. You don't have interaction with other traffic. You can control your environment much easier, so you can run faster. You have a higher acceptance of the systems. So it makes life easier. Typically, when you look at the autonomous systems from a perspective how fast to implement, you look whether you have a controlled environment, semi-controlled, or non-controlled environment, whereas non-controlled obviously is the highest complexity degree of a system. So the more you can control your environment, and dedicated right of ways is one measure, it's way easier to do, and I always would recommend to start with such a system then.
Yeah, and the dedicated, even on rail, but also on BRT or bus, has been around for 10 or 15 years to have dedicated protected guideways. So really the advancement in AV and the more popularity in the last 4 years is getting off of that area, because it is costly. I mean, you can't think about putting a dedicated lane in the middle of downtown Toronto. It just wouldn't work. So there really has to be a way to integrate with those areas, and that's so we don't really focus at all. And it's obviously, it'd be great, like Marko said, to have dedicated, but just from a cost and a kind of a social impact, it just wouldn't work.
Okay, do you see the current IT infrastructure sufficient to support these new technologies? The networks.
Yeah, typically to operate a safe environment, you need a known network to really fulfill the highest safety level. There was the previous question about cybersecurity. That's a must, at least from train way of thinking how to operate a system. I guess in the future we come more to cloud computing, IoT systems, where you separate certain elements of how to have a fleet management, and I guess you can do in certain areas. But the core area of safety functional systems on both the vehicle and wayside elements has to be on an own network where we will have limitation anyway on the bandwidth, which is totally fine. So for now, I think the technology is there to operate it safely.
And I think that our company, like others, is really trying to determine ways where you're not as dependent on the IT infrastructure. And we do use GPS as a means of identifying localization initially, but we have most of the technology is on board. So if you do lose signal of GPS as an example, you can continue to function just like if you did have it. That's kind of an important structure point. So I think that's a key thing. One thing about the infrastructure I think is really interesting is that a lot of companies are now focusing on the V2I or even I to V, where the smart intersections.
Vehicle to infrastructure or
Oh, I'm sorry.
infrastructure
Yeah.
to vehicle.
So infrastructure to vehicle.
Communication.
Which could be a really way to advance, and it's maybe a question for where Canada can really move forward, is that if an intersection is able to broadcast information about what's happening on all four sides up to 200, 300 meters, it's a real advantage to companies like ours because right now we have a limited range with our LiDARs of about 80 meters, and it's not able to really understand if there's a speeding car coming from the far side on the right or the far side of the left. But if you can build smart intersections that can then talk to all the vehicles, that becomes a really way to advance the technology faster than anything else. 40% of accidents happen at intersections. So those are things that we could solve right now just by creating these smart intersections and then talking to vehicles going forward. So.
And maybe you can add maybe talk a little bit about how you are dealing at EasyMile with the amount of data that's being transmitted, and that's being, if tomorrow we have so many AVs on the road, how many data will be and how it will impact the network, and how you're working right now to compress the amount of data that's being transmitted.
Yeah, and that's important because you are working on a kind of a limited bandwidth, so you have to make sure that we try to focus on only broadcasting information that's relative to that moment. We keep most of the data on board. Otherwise, it would really clog up the system. And just if one vehicle is shooting out 10 gigs of data, it's not going to work. So yeah, definitely as another concern is just keeping the communication levels at a very minimum bandwidth.
Lots of startups that are working on this issue.
Maybe just for our part, as I mentioned off the top, I think we're taking an approach where we're looking to ensure that the technology actually works with today's infrastructure. So obviously we think that there's upgrades that can be done in terms of basic care. So repaving the roads, making sure that the lines are very clear so like the technology can read the lanes well, putting up dedicated bike lanes. But our view is that some of the technology about V2I is going to take some time. It's not all settled just yet. And there are a lot of incremental steps that we can take that would allow for more self-driving vehicles on the road with basically the existing infrastructure that we have today.
So we have time for one last question. You've been talking about ground-based transportation. How about aerial AV, autonomous vehicle, as a viable transport solution? So it's more about what you've been seeing in the market, not so much related to your daily life. How do you see aerial autonomous planes in the future, drones?
I think if I relate the technology to how we're building ground transportation technology, I'm not 100% sure how they localize the drones without GPS. So I think with GPS, it makes a lot of sense on how the technology would work. So I think there's plenty of GPS with 5G coming out, becoming a broad-based solution. I think there's probably going to be a lot of growth in aerial. Then the regulation question becomes a very big one at that point, because how close can you fly to airports, to buildings, and I think that becomes maybe a challenge more than anything to get it off the ground as viable. I know Amazon tried a couple of years ago to make that. I was living in Seattle, and that was kind of the goal, was to get everybody delivery by drone, but I think there was a lot of regulations that have to come through on that.
Drones are definitely there. Even GPS is not reliable enough, so using different sensors as well, or sensor fusion, the different means of how to increase the reliability of the system. Drones are being used in the rail industry for monitoring of the track by AV technology, and it's getting more and more as well on airports. And from my sister group, Bombardier Aerospace, I know that they are looking as well into transportation of AV. It's not advanced enough yet. We know there's a few little startup and companies up doing like two-seaters, four-seater. In Dubai, I think there was a press release that they are launching the system up there. But it's much slower than obviously as on ground.
Well, this is actually, I'll drop the AV part, but Uber is actually in the flying car business, as much as there is one right now. So we have a product called Uber Elevate. We've held a couple summits with regards to kind of building urban flying car network that would actually just work with our overall platform system. We're partnering with other players who are more familiar with the space, so like the Bell Helicopters of the world, working with NASA, working with the FAA in the US, just to make sure that all the components that you were referencing are kind of taken care of as we go through this exercise and actually conceive of how we can actually make this a reality. It's moving forward, I think, fairly aggressively. I think the goal would be to have some pilot in this space by 2021. So really not all that far off, but you know, there's investments happening in Paris with regards to this, with our own business. We're in conversations with cities like LA and Dallas. So it's a really exciting time in this space. I think there's a lot that can happen in the future.
Well, I think this is it for us. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.